Now, with so many of you connected, it is my pleasure to officially begin our digital workshop, Building the Peacebuilding Field's Evidence-Based Practice, co-sponsored by George Mason University's Better Evidence Project, the One Earth Future Foundation, and the Alliance for Peacebuilding. My name is Dr. Christina Hook, and I am the Executive Director of the Better Evidence Project in the Center for Peacemaking Practice at George Mason University. At the Better Evidence Project, I like to say that we are the youngest initiative of the oldest university-based peace and conflict program in the United States. We were founded a little over a year ago when the convening power of the Carter School at George Mason University, along with Milt Laurenstein and one of our co-sponsors today, the Alliance for Peacebuilding, gathered nearly 40 experts in our field, similar to the group we've gathered today, but also overlapping in other areas. When this group gathered together, we asked, what are the gaps in the field of war prevention and mitigation? At that time, in February of 2020, we collectively realized that our field still needed to make progress to develop a shared set of key measures describing our successes and effectiveness. And sharing a similar commitment to many of you today, we realized that we must continue to learn from local peacemakers to develop and communicate a stronger evidence base. Now, just around the time that our field's consensus around these evidence-based discussions were percolating and resulting in the creation of the Better Evidence Project, I suddenly learned of the incredibly relevant efforts of my colleagues at OEF and AFP. I remember seeing an advertisement for the survey that Connor and Jessica will share with us and thinking, I need to know these people. Now, here we are a year later, indebted to both these authors and to many of you who took this survey, or maybe who learned of it later. We know that the idea of taking peace-building and peacemaking steps predicated on a strong evidence base is not particularly contentious. But now it's time for us to get into the weeds of this discussion, where the complexities, the contentions, and the applied action-oriented progress really lies. We now turn to two of the survey's authors to walk us through the more thorny issues of what types of evidence we should consider, who gets to decide, and other salient points that the survey revealed. It is my pleasure to now introduce Connor Seal, who is the Senior Strategic Advisor for the One Earth Future Foundation, where he works to support OEF's mission to deliver effective, evidence-based systems for eliminating root causes of armed conflict. His work has focused on questions of how to understand the diverse drivers of conflict and to develop better systems for governance and coordination across organizations and peacebuilding efforts globally. He holds a PhD in social psychology and is the author of multiple academic and popular pieces about conditions supporting peace. We also have today Jessica Baumgardner-Zuzik, who is the Senior Director for Learning and Evaluation at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. She is a design, monitoring, evaluation, and learning specialist and an economist with over 12 years experience in academia and practical application in international development, humanitarian affairs, and peacebuilding. She has over 7 years of field-based experience living and conducting research abroad in rural, conflict-affected, and transitional communities. Connor and Jessica, we are delighted to host you today. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Christina, and welcome everybody. I'm really gratified by the interest in this. What I would like to do is just briefly explain the backstory, and then we will introduce some of the key findings of the report. So the history of this project is that One Earth Future as a foundation is very committed to evidence-based practice in our own work. And a few years ago, we decided we wanted to focus on helping advance the understanding of evidence-based practice and peacebuilding as a whole. But to do that, we wanted to know where the field is. What does the field think about the idea of evidence-based practice? So we reached out with the idea of a survey to several organizations and got a lot of interest and support from groups such as the Peace and Security Funders Group, the Joan B. Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice at the University of San Diego, Peace Science Society, and as Christina mentioned, what became the Better Evidence Project, although in the early days it didn't exist. And we got significant interest from Alliance for Peacebuilding, up to the point where they came on board in the form of Jessica, but also the organization as a whole, as formal partners. And from that point on, Jessica and I collaboratively developed this project, the survey, and its methods together.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Connor, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Just to give you a little bit of information in terms of the purpose of the survey, when we set out doing this research, we really started with 4 key goals. First, we wanted to explore some of the definitional boundaries of peace building. Within the survey, we used a typology of conflict that reflects the way One Earth Future really thinks about conflict dynamics, where we broke conflict into 5 key phases. Those 5 phases somewhat overlap with our broader definitions in relation to peace building, peacekeeping, and peacemaking. So peace building, in terms of structural peace building in the absence of direct conflict, and post-conflict peace building and reconstruction. Peacekeeping in relation to crisis prevention and crisis response, and then peacemaking activities that are attempting to stop ongoing large-scale violence. Secondly, we wanted to explore where the peacebuilding field believes that there is strong or, in some cases, weak evidence for both what can deliver and how to deliver sustainable peace. Thirdly, we wanted to identify evidence gaps in our shared knowledge, and finally, use all of this information to help us identify opportunities for more research. The survey undertook kind of 2 key sections. The first, more qualitative in nature, trying to understand what is evidence, both in terms of what does evidence-based mean to survey participants or subjects, how important it is that the peacebuilding interventions be considered evidence-based for the field, and what do respondents believe is sufficient evidence to be considered evidence-based, both in terms of to use a specific approach or intervention style, to endorse it to others, to endorse it or use for funding or with donors, and then finally, in regards to policy or making new policy. The second section really looked at overall perceptions on the current evidence base. We saw that there is a strong evidence where we saw both strong evidence supporting key peacebuilding outcomes, and where we saw a strong evidence base showing how to effectively deliver these conditions. And both of those were over those kind of 5 key phases that I identified previously. In terms of our sample, in total, we had 207 respondents. And, who were they? How did we get to them? First, we reached out to our peacebuilding partners that Connor already highlighted to help us identify organizations to include within our sample. We developed both an initial organizational sample and sent out email solicitations to that sample, some of whom I'm sure are joining us today. Thank you to everyone who participated. And then we developed also a public promotion on social media to have an even broader sample as possible to participate. It is important to note that the survey asked participants who responded to self-identify if they saw themselves as part of the peacebuilding community in order to continue with the survey. In terms of some of the demographic breakdowns, we saw that 49% of our respondents identified as male, 46% as female, and 5% as prefer not to answer. And then thinking through where these respondents work, what they currently do, and what they've done across their lifetime careers, we did see a pretty general trend in terms of our highest responses being peacebuilding NGOs, followed by academia. And then we got into other breakdowns, but particularly with lifetime experience looking at both international and domestic government agencies.
So we will very briefly go over some of the key findings. Now, in the interest of time, we're not going to go very deep on these, so I encourage you to download the report. And then, of course, in the spirit of evidence-based practice, what we're listing as key findings may not be what you see or what you agree with. So please download the report, engage with the arguments that we make and the data behind them, and decide to yourself, what does it say about evidence? Having said that, some of the things that we see as key findings. First off, the field as a whole is strongly supportive of the idea of evidence-based practice. If you just ask that question, how important is it to you that interventions are evidence-based? The answer is pretty consistently exceptionally high on the scale that we used. And yes, for you quants out here, unfortunately, we are averaging an ordinal scale here. Apologies for that. But I just want to underscore how high that mean is. This is actually a fairly strong central tendency towards a very high support for this question. But as you'll see on the next slide, the devil is in the details. There is a significant amount of disagreement over what the concept of evidence-based practice means. This is based off of the open-ended reports, or the open-ended answers in our qualitative coding. The single largest community in our participants referred to evidence-based as referring to a collection of other work. That is, it's drawing from a large body of existing research But the second largest community, although importantly less than 20% of our sample, said that it is determined by the method or the process employed. That is, legitimacy is deriving from the process. This is where the methods debate that's so prevalent in the kind of formal literature. This is where it lives. Although it's important to note, again, that that's less than 20% of our sample. Going beyond that, some of the smaller voices, but still fairly large communities, say that what matters is the rigor or the quality of the evidence, which is discrete from method. Some people say it's a question of, well, we just need to show that things work. Some people say it needs to be inclusive of beneficiaries or the local perspective. And then we get into smaller, but still very distinct voices saying things such as, well, it's about data and the use of data. It's about context or other perspectives. So there's a very large diversity of perspectives under this general consensus that we need evidence-based practice. This carries through when we ask people, what does evidence-based mean to you? What kind of approach is necessary for you to see something as evidence-based? Now, our question phrased this as a methods question, because that is, again, where we started with understanding where the debate is. But that's not what we found. Instead, our participants had a very nuanced and pragmatic answer to that. To the extent that people engaged with that methods debate, the largest answer was, well, we need all kinds of data. We need multiple mixed method assessments. However, about 20% of our sample rejected that framing entirely. They didn't answer given the formal answers that we gave, and instead picked other, and then it went on to explain, well, it's not about method. It's not a question of, is it qual, is it quant, is it experimental? Instead, it's about other things, about the combination of methods or the rigor or quality. And this, I think, is going to be a theme that we carry throughout this talk. Moving from these abstract questions to questions about specific interventions, we see that considering the breadth of conflict timing, the field appears somewhat siloed. Jessica talked about the way that we asked about different phases of conflict, ranging from peace building in the absence of active conflict to specific peacemaking or crisis engagement. And what we found is that as a field, we are much more comfortable talking about peace building rather than peacemaking or crisis prevention. To some extent, when we look at the scores, asking people about the evidence follows that comfort, but not 100%. It's worth noting that for those people who were comfortable asking about or answering about peacemaking, they felt that there was pretty decent amounts of evidence there. It's just that the people who were comfortable with that evidence weren't necessarily the people answering the questions about peace building and vice versa. And significantly, much fewer people are comfortable talking about the research around crisis prevention and crisis response compared to the other domains of conflict. And then finally, although the report spends much more time on this than we're covering here, if you look at the actual conditions that we ask about, the peacebuilding field actually has a fairly strong consensus that we know what peace looks like. We can describe the conditions necessary for sustainable peace with a sufficient amount of evidence. We do not have the same amount of evidence around what interventions are necessary to deliver those conditions. So when we ask people, what about these different elements about sustainable peace, what we find is that a significant percentage of the participants say we actually have good data describing what sustainable peace looks like. However, this is not true in understanding what's necessary for crisis prevention. However, when we ask people what interventions have evidence showing that we can deliver these conditions, only 3 show up with the admittedly, this is a methods issue, with the methods that we're using to describe a cutoff for having some credible evidence or not. Only 3 meet that cutoff, and those are, 2 of those have to do with women, peace, and security, increasing women's engagement in economic and political life, and women's inclusion in peacemaking processes. All of the other interventions that we asked about failed to meet that criteria.
And the third being education writ large.
Oh, yes, and education.
So then 3 things to note. We've given you a very quick overview of some of the key findings, but as you both read the report and listen to us here, 3 things that really stand out in terms of this process. 1 was this concept of what determines a quality of evidence. As you heard Connor allude to, really trying to understand how we even frame the concept of evidence-based. We did see this rejection of the framing in relation to our question related to evidence-based in certain instances in the survey and responses. We found that participants were relatively disinterested in the methods debate than we've seen necessarily in the extant academic literature. And instead, participants were emphasizing the idea of having multiple approaches to evidence collection focused on shared tenets of quality and rigor. Second, something to consider is the overlap between perception of evidence and actual evidence. This survey really was, it's very important to note, was measuring participants' perceived concept of evidence of the efficacy of interventions, not necessarily the existence of actual evidence, let alone a consideration of the quality of the existing evidence. And then finally, really understanding as a field who we are. Connor alluded to this in terms of the stratified nature of the peacebuilding field. When we think about peacebuilding, peacemaking, peacekeeping, when we talk about different conditions, different interventions, responses to this survey did reflect some of this ongoing definition and discussion in relation to peacebuilding being more broadly associated than just specific interventions around active conflict. Based upon self-selection of participants, we saw that participant knowledge did appear relatively siloed, and many more participants responded to items about peace building in the absence of conflict than responding to those instances of peacekeeping or peacemaking.
And finally, we will very quickly hit what we see as some of the key recommendations and next steps. Although, of course, again, in the spirit of evidence-based practice, we invite you to read the report, consider the evidence, and decide for yourself what the kind of conclusions are. The first one, and this is not surprising, is that we need more evidence on how. We can describe what peace looks like in the abstract, but where we lack as a field is consistent, generalizable evidence about what interventions are successful in delivering those conditions. And as a field, I would encourage us to look in that direction.
Secondly, we do need more ways to talk about rigor and quality rather than just research methods. We saw that participants valued the idea of evidence, and many of them rejected the idea that method and rigor were equivalent, going so far as to call for an assessment of data and evidence that privileged rigor regardless of methods used. So to us, this suggests establishing some sort of generally agreed upon standard that could help us assess rigor and quality of evidence that could be regardless of the research methodology employed would really be invaluable for our field. Thirdly, we saw that we do need a shared understanding of peacebuilding. The breadth of interventions and conditions that are demonstrated within this survey that highlight the complexity of our field, we think would benefit from at least a generally shared understanding of what is included in building peace. Developing some sort of peer-reviewed, peer-accepted typology would allow us to act as a first step. And that doesn't mean, this is important, that this is a discrete or final event, but rather an ongoing process for our field. We believe that the fragmentation that we're witnessing both in the survey and writ large contributes to not only missed opportunities for collaboration and shared learning, but it also presents greater difficulty for assessment and promoting evidence of the effectiveness of peacebuilding writ large, both for policy and for funding considerations.
And relatedly, we encourage everyone to develop an understanding of the broader spectrum of peacebuilding or peacemaking and the evidence surrounding it. It's easy for us as organizations working in peace to focus on one specific intervention or one specific domain. But the challenge is, of course, is that conflict doesn't necessarily allow us to do that. And if we are the only organization operating in an area, we may not be allowed to focus solely on peacebuilding if the conflict changes rapidly. We are going to be seen as an organization speaking to peace, and our partners may ask us or expect us to contribute across domains of conflict. And of course, it's also the case that conflict is not as easily reducible to these different phases. In any specific environment, there's going to be one area which is a peacebuilding, one which is a crisis response, one which is a peacemaking area. And then finally, and relatedly, the one last thing I'd say is that in our survey, we necessarily atomized the conversation. We asked about discrete phases and discrete interventions and conditions as if you could kind of disentangle the complex conflict system into these areas. Now, that's part of understanding the evidence around these different things. And I would encourage us to develop narrow and specific evidence. However, as we're doing that, we also need to understand the relationships between these different interventions, different components, and the ways that they influence each other, because peace is going to be achieved at that systemic level. And I think that this is a new challenge for the field. It's acknowledged in the Global Fragility Act. It's acknowledged in the increasing focuses on peace systems and conflict systems, but I'm not sure it's necessarily acknowledged in the evidence yet, because it's kind of a challenge. And I think that we need to think about how to do that. So thank you very much. We appreciate your interest and look forward to the next step.
Thank you so much.
Connor and Jessica, thank you very much for coming today. It is wonderful to hear directly from you. And we invite our audience to also look at the survey. There's some very interesting geographic information in the survey. And I think in addition to this type of work being important for those of us around the world, it's also very relevant for those of us coming at these questions from slightly different professional angles, such as from policymakers, practitioners, researchers, and donors. And on that note, we are delighted now to welcome Marcel Arsenault, who is joining us today. He is the co-founder, along with his wife, Cinda Collins Arsenault, of One Earth Future, as well as the grant-making foundation Pax Sapiens and Secure World Foundation. Through these foundations, Marcel pursues his passion of promoting systems of governance which prevent war. He is a member of the Giving Pledge and has worked as a member of the board of several different nonprofit organizations to focus on environmentalism and supporting people with developmental disabilities. As founder of Real Capital Solutions, he oversees a portfolio exceeding $1.5 billion in real estate assets and is a contributing author of How to Build a Real Estate Empire. Particularly fascinating, he was working on a PhD in molecular biology when he started his career as an entrepreneur. We are delighted to welcome you today and to hear from you about how this relates to philanthropy. Marcel, the floor is yours. Marcel, are you able to join us today? I know as a backup, we have your executive director standing by. John, are you with us? Well, while we work out a technical issue, why don't we move on now to Elizabeth Liz Hume. We're also thrilled to have the Alliance for Peacebuilding's acting CEO and president also joining us. Liz, I appreciate your flexibility as I've bumped you up the schedule a bit. I wonder if you could now speak with us. To introduce you to a room that likely already knows you, Elizabeth Liz Hume is a conflict expert and has more than 20 years of experience in senior leadership positions in bilateral organizations, multilateral institutions, and NGOs. You have extensive experience in policy and advocacy, as well as overseeing sizable and complex peacebuilding programs in conflict-affected and fragile states in Asia, Eastern Europe, and Africa. Liz, we are delighted that you could join us today. Are you able to connect and speak now?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can. Thank you so much for your flexibility, Liz. I've put you on the spot, but the floor is yours.
No, it's okay. No worries. It says, just so you know, you can't see me because the host has, I can't start my video because the host has stopped it. So I think we might be having some challenges on that end, but it's okay. You can hear me, so that's good. So can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
we'll work
great.
to get your video going.
Okay, no worries. Okay, so I just want to say thank you so much to One Earth Future Foundation and also Jessica, the Senior Director at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. This work is exceptional and it's exactly what the field needs right now. If you've heard me speak, before, you've heard me talk about how critical evidence is to the field. So I just want to go back a little bit and talk about when I was first at USAID and we were starting up the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. The funds were limited, so we were pushing programs out. And if I had to go back in time, I would have focused more on evidence. We were focused on just getting work out the door and programs running. And that was a really big I think that has, you know, if I had to go back and change something and say how, you know, the field could have been moved forward, it would have been to make sure that we had evidence funding and baked it in from the very beginning. So I take responsibility as one person who was there at the time. So we've really been pushing this evidence-based, and it doesn't matter what administration that's in. Under the Obama administration, that was what they told us over and over again. If you can't prove it, why should we be funding it? We hear it on the Hill all the time in Congress. And so that is why we are so grateful for the Carnegie Corporation as well. And I see Steve on here. They're the ones that funded this. It's not sexy. It's, you know, it's not as exciting. You can't see direct beneficiaries, but it is critical to the peace building field and moving the field forward. So we're grateful for the funding that put together this evidence that started 8-9 years ago. So let me just tell you quickly in terms of what are some of the challenges and how AFP and other organizations have been pushing this forward. It's really around, if you want it, the donors have to require it and they have to fund it. And if you have a program that is $500,000 or $1 million, it's hard to do that, but it has to happen. We also have to build the capacity of organizations, implementing partners, to be able to actually do the work. It's hard, it's not easy. AFP has put out the 7 steps, and there was a lot of discomfort on if you call them standards or not. But it talks about doing a literature review and a baseline assessment. I mean, we're kind of there in terms of you know, 101. And many of the other sectors, like the health sector, tell us, we can't believe you guys get away with what you get away with, because you're not able to generate this type of evidence. More importantly, again, if you've heard, you know, you've seen it, if you heard me say it, we have to bake this into the requirements. Under the Global Fragility Act, we got the need for evidence-based learning in the Global Fragility Act. We've gotten it into the UN Sustaining Peace Agenda, to the World Bank Fragility Strategy. These are key, but if we don't implement them, they're just words on a paper. And so that's why this report is so critical. It shows the need, talks about the how we do it. And then just the next point is, when we do have this data, we have, and there is some data out there, we have to be transparent about it. We have to share so that we can replicate it. If we don't, the field will not move forward. We will not be able to elevate the field. So, you know, just again, I can't thank One Earth Future Foundation and Jessica for the work they've done, the Better Evidence Program, Susan, the support that donors like Carnegie had for this work. The field will not move forward without good evidence. So
thank you so much for these remarks today. I think that you are one of those speakers out there where video is a plus, but the expertise and the commitment in your voice also, I think, also forcefully communicates your points. And we're very grateful for what you've said and for your presence with us today. I believe that we now have Marcel on the line with us. And Marcel, I have just introduced you. We are delighted to welcome you as the co-founder of One Earth Future Foundation, and the floor is now yours.
Well, thank you. Presumably my voice can go disappointing. I apologize for the technical problems. I'm speaking to you from Mexico today. And it's a wonderful interconnected world, and hopefully one that we can create more peace in. Let's start with a basic question. Why does One Earth Future support empiricism? Well, it's empiricism is a core value of One Earth Future. We commit ourselves to being relentlessly empirical. Empirically based analysis to guide decision-making is fundamental to delivering lasting value. As you heard, I started life as a scientist and then a businessman, so I probably come upon it naturally. But basically, any actions we take are hopefully driven by the best available evidence for our field. At One Future, we have an expression: utility matters. Utility, in turn, is guided by empiricism. A foundational problem with philanthropy is how and where the concept of philanthropy originates. It comes from the desire to help. Indeed, the word itself means love of mankind. Philanthropy is basically a moral imperative. Moral approaches feel good, but don't necessarily work. Indeed, throughout history, all moral approaches seemed appropriate at the time. Only later did we realize that these approaches were wrong. The Children's Crusade was a moral call to save the Holy Land. In hindsight, it was neither effective nor a great moral undertaking. If one feels good about something but doesn't work empirically, is that sufficient? I think not. Our advice is, number one, set your goals carefully. Number two, achieve them effectively. Number three, measure everything. And number four, iterate constantly. Another problem with philanthropy is philanthropy own the money. Money belongs to them. The American ethic gets to want money. Today, you can invest in going to live on Mars. Nobody gets to tell you no. Europe is dotted with churches built by philanthropists of their time. Many cathedrals were built to house relics stolen from Holy Land. Churches were funded by people trying to please God. We all had great intentions. To many, the goal of achieving global peace might appear exotic, but Steven Pinker assures us that humanity has been making great progress on the path to peace. Once we have determined our goal, peace, or perhaps at least a more secure world, we each need to make sure that our money and our precious time doesn't contribute to failed strategies. When I joined the Peace and Security Funders, the ED 10 years ago told me, welcome to philanthropy. From now on, all your calls will be answered and your jokes will be funny. The point that he made is that no one holds philanthropists accountable. That falls on us to do. I found in my life, money is merely an accelerant. Attack bad ideas. Money actually makes bad ideas worse. The discourse tends to emphasize money because most of us think we have enough. The real limits are usually with us and our system. They're not within our wallets. But I've observed that money can be stupid, and in many situations, money seems to make humans more stupid than they need to be. Empiricism, thus, must be our guide. First, you set out a goal, then you measure, and then you constantly refine your strategy and you refine your tactics. That's our belief. Empiricism is a tool for holding ourselves accountable to the impact we want. It makes us constantly strive to improve impact. The nice thing about empiricism is that it usually cuts across all issues. There isn't a moralist alive who will be happy to know their goals were not met. There isn't a rationalist alive who doesn't want to improve their impact. The history of human, as we talked about, is a long history of being confidently wrong for moral pursuit. The Spanish Inquisition was one, and in the last couple 100 years or time memorial before that, the dismissive attitude we had towards women in society. Those are previously moral positions that turned out not to have good evidence. Had our ancestors relied on empirical evidence-based decision-making, we'd be farther along the path. Learning and accountability helps us mitigate a tendency towards hubris and the power of our, quote, great. We don't claim that evidence-based approaches are inherently value. You start a journey by beginning with value. Our value happens to be peace. You strive to avoid hubris when considering helpful getting closer to the truth. So much philosophy on why empiricism. OEF conducted this research with our partners because we believed it was the right path for the field. It is true that such approaches may not be personally satisfying. Evidence is cold and it's not very inspirational. Evidence suggests that our way forward is effective or ineffective. If our path and methods are ineffective, we need to know, and we need to know soon. In general, our people at OEF expected result of this survey demonstrated that the world is, in general, getting better at understanding the drivers of peace and getting better at delivering them. In general, most practitioners expect and want evidence-based making to help create general circumstances that indirectly support peace. In general, most practitioners expect and want evidence-based decision-making for determining what intervention in a crisis are likely to decrease conflict. We must continue to create improvements in the quality of life internationally. The world is one integrated place, and we're all in it together. One problem on one side of the world against impact on the other side. We must study the patterns that lead to getting closer to our goal of peace. Pinker, who even recently reasserted the world is getting better for us, noticed we're biased towards negativity. We erroneously expect destruction. Stephen uses the mega or the empirical data to prove that by almost every metric of human well-being, the world is getting better. War, violence, and poverty are all declining. Peace and understanding the drivers towards peace is yet work undone. Social sciences don't easily lend themselves to empiricism. I like molecular biology and economics because at least it's a little easier than the efforts we're trying to do building a peaceful world. Humans are a formula, and human societies especially, are formulas that defy easy analysis, but the job is difficult. It's definitely worth doing. We're in the early, or perhaps at best, the middle innings of creating the empirical paradigm and understanding exactly what works. We may be retreating to a social renaissance altogether if we understand what truly supports peace. We're not there yet. It may take decades. The challenge for the peace building field is for us to continue to hold ourselves accountable, not to let ourselves get distracted by the things we want to be true. The search for truth is about what works and what doesn't. We must build on the gains the world has made in understanding and delivering peace. There's joy in feeling like you're helping others, but there's greater joy in knowing that you are. By your work and action, we each share in the privilege of adding to this important human journey. Congratulations. That's an inspiration to me and an honor to me as a philanthropist and others that are privileged to support your work. By the way, that's the emotion in me speaking. So thank you for your work, and I look forward to the discussion.
Relentlessly empirical and accountable. Thank you very much, Marcel. We now pivot from philanthropy to academia, and it is my pleasure to next welcome Dean of the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, Dr. Apaslan Ozerdim. He is also a professor of conflict and peace and conflict studies. He specializes in conflict resolution, peace building, and post-conflict reconstruction, with more than 20 years of field experience in conflict-affected countries around the world. He has published extensively with 14 books and numerous journal articles, book chapters, and op-eds. As a scholar practitioner, he takes an active role in the initiation and management of advisory and applied research projects like the Better Evidence Project, as well as trainings for a wide range of national and international organizations like the United Nations and international NGOs. Alp, it's my pleasure to yield the floor to you now.
Thank you very much, Christina. I hope the next 5 minutes, there won't be many technological problems for you to sort out. So good afternoon, everyone. And I'd like to start by thanking our co-organizers of this important digital workshop, the Alliance for Peacebuilding and One Earth Future Foundation. And I'd like to congratulate them for putting together such an important report for the peacebuilding field. As we have just heard from Connor and Jessica, with the goal of improving the entire field's ability to deliver sustainable peace, this study aims to contribute to a better understanding of the views of peacebuilding practitioners on evidence-based practice. With that in mind, in my remarks, I'd like to focus on advocating for the need for evidence to guide peacemaking initiatives within the wider needs of the peacebuilding field. So while peacebuilding and peacemaking are often used interchangeably, we note that distinctions between the two have existed since Johan Galtung's foundational work many decades ago. Complex war and conflict environments present a plethora of challenges, while peacebuilding focuses on pre-conflict and post-conflict activities to fully restore shattered societies. Peacemaking focuses on urgent crisis response in the immediate lead up to or in the midst of armed conflict, that is conflict prevention and mitigation. So in the AFP-OEF survey, the following insight was generated. When you read the report, you will see this. Called active peacemaking interventions, crisis prevention and crisis response were relatively less understood, and fewer participants felt comfortable discussing the evidence around the stages of conflict, close the quote. And in fact, this is a key area of Better Evidence Project's focus here at the Carter School. We seek to address this gap in the field's knowledge. If the survey is repeated in 5 years, we'd like to see that by then more people know about and are comfortable using the evidence of what works for peacemaking in what sort of contexts. We want to contribute to this development of the field. So we are gathering evidence from international scholarly studies and from local actors who engage in their own conflicts and devise creative solutions to solve them, despite obviously the worst surrounding circumstances of war and violence. As we learn from these local voices, the Better Evidence Project in the Center for Peacemaking Practice at our school works to elevate the evidence generated from local knowledge and from decades of scientific discovery in order to prevent and end wars worldwide. Beyond generating new research breakthroughs, we understand that putting cutting-edge evidence in the hands of the right actors is a core component of achieving peacemaking goals in the midst of urgent crisis. By serving as a central connector, meeting place, catalytic convener, and resource for our partners, the Better Evidence Project works together with our partners to identify the missing evidence that reports like the one we are discussing today tell us. We take practical steps to generate and collect such evidence, as well as disseminate it to key decision makers at key moments. Such efforts obviously take intense dedication by many people, ranging from our Better Evidence Project staff to student interns to research affiliates. In addition to our BEP advisory board and leadership, including the generous support from Milt Lowenstein, the next generation of peacemaking can be witnessed in active cohorts of students, interns, and affiliates across George Mason University, Georgetown University, and the University of Notre Dame. Altogether, we have grown to more than 40 people working in various ways to uphold Better Evidence Project's peacemaking mission over the past year since its founding. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues, Dr. Susan Allen and Dr. Christina Hook, for their wonderful work with this project. So just to conclude my remarks, we invite you to join in this mission. Wars present some of our world's most urgent moral issues, most challenging problems. We are grateful for surveys, especially the one we have gathered here to discuss, and we'll look forward to concrete partnerships coming from this event, especially emerging consensus around the critical importance of peacemaking evidence to each of our shared goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to both welcome my dean and my advisory board chair, so we appreciate your attendance today. We have one final speaker before we'll turn to audience Q&A, and it is now my pleasure to introduce Stephen Del Rosso. He is the Director of International Peace and Security Program at the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Previously, he was the Director of Programs at the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations and managed the Pew Charitable Trust Global Security Program. He served a decade in the U.S. Foreign Service with overseas assignments in Central America and the Caribbean, and in Washington in the Operations Center, and as a staff officer to Secretary of State George Shultz, among other assignments. He is also a former Presidential Management Fellow at NASA, a news producer at the Voice of America, and a staff assistant to a British Member of Parliament. Among other degrees, he holds a PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining us today, Stephen.
Good afternoon, and thank you, and thanks to the organizers and the speakers that preceded me. They're tough acts to follow. I'll give it a shot. As a grant maker who's been supporting peacebuilding work for, I hate to admit it, decades, I commend the authors of the report. While some of the findings were not surprising, it's clear that the field of peacebuilding evaluation has advanced during this period. Carnegie Corporation was pleased to support the Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium organized by AFP and the DME for Peace that grew out of it, as well as other evaluation efforts. While I recognize the undeniable progress, though, I can't help observing that many of the foundational challenges in the field persist, despite, or perhaps in some cases because of, the professionalization of the field. Let me offer some modest comments on a few perennial challenges noted in the report from the perspective of one person representing one foundation. On defining peacebuilding, this remains an unresolved and, in my view, essentially unresolvable issue. Years ago in the Peace and Security Funders Group, we had a subcommittee on peacebuilding. Some foundation members felt that while their grant making might be peacebuilding adjacent, they couldn't agree on the term peacebuilding to describe it. So we settled on informally calling it the Subcommittee on Underwater Basket Weaving. The point is that at the end of the day, it didn't matter what we called it. As the report states, there is no one answer to the question of what constitutes peacebuilding. It goes on to say it's probably a fool's errand and potentially destructive to expect the field to have a single universally accepted framework. I'd add that it's also unnecessary. Like the proverbial blind man and the elephant, every funder seems to have a different take on what it is they're touching. Its borders may be hard to discern, and some parts may be more prominent than others, but in the end, there really is an elephant there that is recognizable if we step back and open our eyes. So the good news is that despite the definitional imprecision, there is, as the report further states, a generally shared understanding of what is included in building peace. As the political scientist Susan Woodward once described to me in the early 2000s, peacebuilding is a field in the making. I think it still is, and this is positive in my view, even if it complicates matters, not least evaluation. On learning and accountability, again, what was old is new again. I'm reminded of the great Herb Kelman, whose work I supported in the early 1990s at Pew. Herb told me then that he just couldn't take the time from his important work to try to evaluate or even document what he was doing. As his grant officer and advocate within the foundation, I tried to persuade him that it was in his interest to do this, if for no other reason than his grant depended on it. Being far smarter than I, he later conceded that he understood that establishing a record of of his interactive problem-solving workshops was not only beneficial to his funder, but to his own work. He found a cost-effective way to do this by enlisting graduate students to observe and take notes at his workshops that he would later review to feed into subsequent sessions and to report to his funders on how he defined and measured progress. The field has come a long way since then, and Herb, thankfully, is still with us. But the trade-off for underfunded NGOs between devoting time, attention, and money to evaluation and implementing their programs is, of course, still with us. That's also not surprising. Learning and accountability, while sometimes intention, also have to go hand in hand. But they are variably important at different times. I have no doubt that peace-building practitioners value the learning that can inform their work. But I also recognize that for very practical reasons, their reporting has to be tailored to the needs of the funder, in some cases, multiple funders. And certainly not all, but a good number of funders are, shall we say, idiosyncratic in how we define both evidence and impact. In terms of sharing what has been learned, well, DM&E for Peace, for example, has made great strides in providing a platform for this for very understandable reasons. In a competitive field with finite and often hard to secure funding sources, it's understandable that practitioners would be hesitant to advertise their shortcomings, even if defining failure is in many ways as difficult as defining success. What the late president of Carnegie Corporation, Vartan Gregorian, called the illuminating failure is often not something talked about in polite company, especially with a funder. And I should add that program staff at foundations are human too. Whatever rhetorical support there might be for highlighting a grant's deficiencies, there is a similar reluctance to accentuate the negative. Finally, let me say that I was pleased to see that most respondents to the survey were not evangelists for one church of methods or the other. There was instead a healthy appreciation for methodological pluralism that parallels work that Carnegie supports on bridging the gap between scholarship and policy. Particularly in the political science field, there's a long-running debate between formal modelers using sophisticated quantitative methods and the researchers using qualitative methods. Both have their place, and both can be policy relevant as the other. While rigor and relevance are also valued, the third R that we've tried to add to the debate is readability, being able to present findings, however derived, in ways that are clear, jargon-free, and ideally convincing to broader audiences. And this, of course, also applies to the still field in the making of peace building. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Stephen, thank you very much. And as you've mentioned pluralism, I think we've had just a taste of some of the diversity of viewpoints in our field on this call today. We are nearing the bottom of the hour, but I want to note that we have another hour and a half of programming after this webinar session. And so the questions and the discussion that I'm seeing both in the Q&A box and the chat is invited to continue into the breakout rooms that we will shortly enter. Before we do that, I do want to turn the Q&A session over to Connor and Jessica again. As I was looking through a few of the questions that have been asked, I note for discussion about 4 categories. We have questions coming in that relate to typology. We have questions coming in that relate to rigor. We have sample questions coming in, and then we also have some budgetary implications to doing the work of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So with that in mind, and also noting that Connor and Jessica are answering some of the individual questions as they come in, I turn things over back to them for your comments on these questions.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. And Connor and I were trying to assiduously and quickly respond to some of them in the Q&A section, because I know that we always, have limited time for answering. So please do reference a couple of those where we provided some very detailed and data-driven answers. Just a couple of thoughts to some of the broad level questions that came in. And thank you so much for all of our respondents and thought leaders for some of your reflections, both in terms of the report, but also the state of the field and where we're at, and hopefully where we're continuing to go. In terms of I'm going to address really quickly in terms of rigor and quality. There were a couple questions referenced to that. I would say, one, we are going to have a great breakout session that I'm really excited about to have this conversation. So I encourage anyone who wants to learn more to please join it in the next part of our session. But one of the things that we are considering in Alliance for Peacebuilding is trying to understand what are some of those signposts that would allow us to better assess quality and rigor, both of programming, but particularly of interest in reference to this conversation in terms of evidence that would be divorced from the type of methods utilized to collect that data. And something important to consider, and we say often, is that the type of method should be driven by the questions that are being asked and evaluated, not by a preferential style. So as Stephen said, respecting that pluralism, those methods are in response to what we're trying to collect, not what we want to do. And I think that that has a big implication, but we are looking at different signposts, like when something is peer reviewed, when there's an external evaluator in use who's been employed to participate, if there has been any publication of the research outside of potentially organization or sharing of those findings externally, things like that that could help us better say, well, other people have paid attention to this, other people have contributed, and we do feel that the field has said this is of higher quality than just it doesn't meet validating internal external bias, but maybe there are certain components of that too. I think in terms of the sample, we've responded to quite a few within there, but definitely acknowledging that sampling is always difficult. And the survey was produced in English. And yes, we did have limited factors in terms of translating responses. However, we did have identified responses from over 35 countries of organizations in terms of where individuals were affiliated. That does not necessarily indicate nationality. However, they were quite diverse compared to just the big heavy hitters that we anticipated. So it did get farther and wider than anticipated, but of course there are limiting factors concerning who's answering and to what degree. And then I would just say really quickly in terms of budgetary implications, something important to remember that when it comes to monitoring evaluation, I think Stephen really highlighted this when he was reflecting upon some of the initial grantees that he worked with. There's a value to the implementing organization in order to do things right, well received, that are reflective of the context and are really responding to beneficiary and local needs. And we only can get that through periods of assessment and reflection and adaptation. But at the same time, we also do need donors to both fund and support more rigorous monitoring, evaluation, and learning efforts to make this part and parcel. It's not an add-on component, it's a critical component to make sure that we are effectively doing the best job we can and learning from our mistakes as a field and collectively to continue doing better. So it goes both sides there, and definitely with all of our esteemed guests here, our participants, making sure that we have that conversation with our donors to both fund, support, and continue doing ongoing, both, internal implementation, programming effectiveness, but also ex post and meta-ketas, and trying to understand writ large some of these individual as well as broad level implications. So I'll close it there and hand over to Connor.
Cool. And so, yes, we'll try to do just kind of some responses to some general themes that we see in the questions. But I encourage people to reach out directly via email, via Twitter, whatever, to continue this conversation. So first off, a couple of the questions in the Q&A have to deal with to what extent is this generalizable? And I have two answers to that. One is, it is important to note the limitations of our study. The majority of our participants, well, everybody was English speaking. The survey was delivered in English, and the majority of the participants were primary English speakers from the Western countries. So when we think about our findings, when we talk about the peacebuilding field, put a big caveat on that. They were not universal. About 45% of our sample was not from the US, and as Jessica said, they were from many different countries. So it is a broader sample than just pure like American or British professionals. But the English limitation is going to color the way that we should think about this. Having said that, a couple of the questions asked about, well, are there differences if you look at subgroups? If you consider only people responding from Sub-Saharan Africa, only people responding from the private sector, things like that. And when we conducted this survey, we actually thought that that was going to be one of the primary contributions, was identifying gaps between discrete communities, because then that would allow for a conversation. Hey, look, this community disagrees with or has this attitude while this other one has a different opinion. We actually didn't find that. Now, to some extent, this is a methods finding, but when I say that, what I mean is there were no statistically significant or detectable differences using the methods that we used between the subgroups. So of course, that becomes a whole methods debate. You can argue about like whether the methods we were using were sophisticated or powered enough to detect it. But with that finding, what we actually found was that there were no detectable differences between subgroups wherever we looked, whether that was by education, by profession, by sector, by level in the different group, with one tiny finding, which was that years of experience led to a very small decrease in endorsement of the overall concept of evidence-based practices. It was still very high, but it was on the order of every 5 years of experience would lead to a 1/10 of a point decrease or something like that. So that's why we led, in terms of describing this, with a discussion of consensus. My perspective of this is that we all, as peace builders, have our specific things that we value, our specific points of entry, or the specific things that we think are the most important. But once you move past that, if you ask people, what is the evidence out there, we're all driving from the same basic understanding. And that, to me, is a really positive foundation for thinking about next steps. One final thing that I would want to say, I echo Jessica's call that as we talk about limitations for the evidence here, a lot of it has to do with resources. And funders need to be thinking about how do we fund these data. And then there's an important point that I would append to that, which is that I encourage us all as peace builders to accept the sometimes ugly necessity of acknowledging when things don't work. And this is something that as a field, we are just not that great about. I am personally aware of a lot of data around what kind of interventions work and don't work that I cannot share because I had to basically swear a blood oath to be able to see somebody's assessment of an intervention. And usually they actually are very effective. Usually people are saying, hey, these work. They just maybe didn't work as well as we told our funders that we thought it would in advance. As a field, we don't like to admit that. And that, I think, hinders our collective understanding about what works and what doesn't. And I really encourage us to follow the example of some of the organizations that are just really blazing the trail here, with, of course, I've got to call that Search for Common Ground on this, in actually publicly posting the results of our assessments. OEF is developing in that direction. We're not quite as advanced as this as Search is, but it's something that we aspire to, and it's something that I encourage us as organizations to do. And yes, in the chat, somebody called out Mercy Corps. Yes, I can't overlook Mercy Corps. Mercy Corps is really absolutely a trailblazer in both the attention they're paying to their evaluations and the larger kind of structural research behind it. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to the more in-depth conversations that we'll have next.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Jessica Baumgartner-Zuzik and Connor Seal, who have led the way on creating the survey. And now I think the most important events have two aspects. First, they have more questions than answers. So check, we've achieved that. But the next criteria that we really need to hit with this event is to translate all of this complexity and all of this good thinking into actionable next steps. So with that, we're going to begin transitioning today's workshop into the discussion-oriented breakout rooms. Before we do that, I do want to say on behalf of the Better Evidence Project and our co-sponsors at One Earth Future Foundation and the Alliance for Peacebuilding, we are very grateful to our audience who has joined us, and we also give our deepest thanks to Marcel, Liz, Alp, and Stephen for joining us today, and to so many people who participated in this survey. Now, as I said, our event is not over. We will now be transitioning over to those discussion breakout rooms, which are led again by leaders in our field who are generously giving of their time and expertise today. We will now move to a short coffee break lasting about 10 minutes. And so at 1:15, we will transition over to these groups. You can click the link in the chat, the same link for all 5 groups with the descriptions about to pop up on the screen. So we'll transition over there. We thank you for attending this first hour, and we thank you to all the many people who have worked behind the scenes to pull this event off. See you soon in those groups.